It's a real delight and pleasure for me to introduce this morning's keynote speaker. I first met Gary in 2011 when we were way ahead of the curve and did a conference on the topic of the intersection of population aging and climate change. And since that time, Gary and I have worked together on a number of projects, some of which he will touch on in his talk this morning. But for the last several years, we've been communicating basically by Zoom or on the phone. And when he came and we met up, and I said, "Oh my gosh, you're much taller than I remember." So it was really in your program, you will see that there is a brief description that tells us that he spent 15 years at the York Center on transport, air pollution, low carbon futures, climate change, and aging. And from 2012 to 2020, he was on the European Commission's Joint Research Center in Ispra, supporting European transport and environmental policy. He's a human ecologist with over 20 years of experience in Africa, Asia, Europe, and he provides evidence to policymakers. He facilitates processes and builds capacity. And he's led a number of international programs on air pollution, transport, climate communication, and he's advised the UK government on low carbon transport. He has a PhD in geography, and he's the author of 5 books and numerous publications. But I really wanted him to come and be here with us and to open this conference because he's a big picture person. And he is able to talk to us about these issues, not just from the point of view of the UK or from our local issues, but rather the big picture. And in designing this conference, we specifically wanted to have the international perspective. We've got some people here who are on national committees, and it was very interesting. You know, we just saw Kelly White in the role of somebody who is talking about the indigenous population. What I discovered yesterday when we went to a World Cafe, she was a pioneer. She was with the federal government on various committees and has been involved in this issues of climate change for many, many, many years. So we see her in her ceremonial role, but if you Google her, you will find that she also is a very accomplished person and was very appropriate to be the person to speak this morning. So on that note, I'd like to invite you to welcome my friend, my colleague, Gary Hack.
So give me a moment to rearrange the furniture here, please. So I just wanted to check, is this for the changing the slide? Yeah. Yeah, okay, just click, thank you. Okay, thank you, Gloria, and good morning, everybody. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure for me to be here in Vancouver, speaking to you today on aging and climate change, especially because today is Earth Day, a moment that reminds us of our shared responsibility for the planet and the urgency to take action now. I would like to begin by thanking the Gerontology Research Centre, and in particular Professor Andrew Wister for chair of the conference, and of course my friend and colleague, co-chair Professor Gloria Gutman for this invitation. I think it's especially meaningful, as Gloria mentioned, that I was able to return to this conference, so I'm thanking also Melanie for your family to organise this, because back in 2011 we held the first conference, I think it was titled Growing Old in a Changing Climate, after a report that I did. And at that time, not many people were talking about this intersection between ageing and climate change. And since then, working with Gloria and seeing how the interest and the awareness is increasing with more evidence, it's really timely that now, today, we're here to discuss climate change in an ageing world. And it's a time, I think, also, I need to give credit to Simon Fraser University and the Gerontology Research Centre for being so forward-looking, because I don't think there's a conference that's actually considered ageing and climate change together. There have been sessions in conferences, but not a conference dedicated to that. So we really are still at the front of the curve, Gloria. So the title of my keynote today is From Earth Day to Every Day, Aging in a Changing Climate. And in this talk, I would like to reflect on the environmental thinking, how environmental thinking has evolved, and what this means for our understanding aging in the context of climate change. And I want to draw on my work at the Stockholm Environment Institute at the University of York. The Stockholm Environment Institute is an international organisation. It's Swedish. We have our headquarters based in Stockholm. It's named after the place Stockholm, but also the 1972 first global conference on the human environment was held in Stockholm. So there's two reasons why it's called the Stockholm Environment Institute. And we're really a truly global organisation with centres around the world. And our mission is to bridge the gap between science and policy. So providing that scientific evidence base in order to achieve change for a more sustainable future. And as you can see, some of the publications that we've been working on, also with Gloria back in 2008, and since then continuing this work on looking at the intersection between aging and climate change. But to understand where we are today, it's worth reflecting on where this thinking began. Now, many of you will be familiar with this Earthrise image from 1968, captured during the Apollo 8 mission. For the first time, it revealed that our planet, in the vastness of space, is small, fragile, and finite. It transformed how we saw the Earth, and highlighting that we share a single planet with limits, and the beginning, for many, this image of the start of the environmental movement. So by the late 1960s, environmental damage was becoming impossible to ignore. Oil spills polluted coastlines, rivers were contaminated by industrial waste, cities were choked with smog, and chemicals were harming wildlife and entering the food chain. In Canada, parts of the Great Lakes were heavily polluted, with declining water quality and dying fish, while industrial activity damaged forests and landscapes. These were problems people experienced directly in the air they breathed and in the environment around them. And in response, millions came together around a shared recognition that our relationship with the environment had to change. And in 1970, the first Earth Day on Wednesday, the 22nd of April, turned that awareness into action. And it was a moment where environmental damage was tangible, immediate, and in many cases seen as solvable. So I'm just wondering, does anybody remember the first Earth Day in 1970 here? 2. Any more? It's great. So since then, But even then, when we talked about those kind of environmental problems we could see, there was also another challenge, a deeper challenge, and this was suggested by an economist, Kenneth Balding, in 1966, when he called what he called a cowboy economy, based on endless expansion and the assumption that resources are unlimited, with a spaceship, comparing it to a spaceship economy, an idea often described as spaceship Earth, where the planet is understood to be a closed system. In that system, resources are finite. Waste does not simply disappear. It has to go somewhere, and into the air, the water, or the soil, and we must be managed within the limits of the planet. So today, these insights back then, in the 1960s, 70s, are no longer theoretical. The system that sustains our life, the air we breathe, the water we drink, and the food we eat, are increasingly under strain. So this chart tells a simple, important story. Each bar represents a year from 1970 to today. The blue section shows how far into the year we live within the Earth's ecological limits, how long natural systems can sustain our demand. The red section marks the point at which we exceed those limits, where demand outpaces what the Earth can regenerate. What this chart makes very clear is how that threshold has shifted over time. In the early 1970s, we were operating within the planet's means for most of the year, but gradually that point has moved earlier and earlier. Today, Earth Overshoot Day falls in July, meaning that for nearly half the year, global demand exceeds what the Earth can renew. In simple terms, we are now consuming resources faster than the Earth can replenish. In effect, humanity is using resources at a rate equivalent to around 1.5 Earths. Of course, we only have one, but what this reflects is that the depletion of natural systems, forests, soils, and fisheries, and the buildup of emissions are beyond what the planet can absorb. But today, the environmental challenges are very different from those in the 1970s. We have the issue of climate change. We see the impacts of climate change, flood, heat, and extreme weather. But now its underlying cause is the buildup of greenhouse gases. So while previously we were able to see like polluted rivers, greenhouse gases is something we can feel the effects of increasing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, but we don't necessarily see them, so it's slightly less visual, if you like. And it's more systematic, and it's global. So we have moved from problems that we could see to risks we must anticipate. And many of those who were part of that early environmental movement, some of you are here today, are now older adults, living with the consequences of the change they helped to bring about the public attention back in the early 60s. So it's going from, the early environmental awareness from that first Earth Day to today. The environmental problems have changed. We've been able to clean up lots of our parts of our environment, but now we're dealing with something greater, and that's climate change. And so climate change is fundamentally a human issue, and increasingly an aging one. We are living through two major global transformations, a changing climate and an aging world. And that's what we're considering here today and tomorrow in this conference. Together, they will shape patterns of vulnerability, resilience, and response. The science is clear on climate change. The World Meteorological Organization confirms that the past 11 years have been the 11 warmest on record. This is no longer a distant possibility. It's already being experienced. Climate change is real, and it's happening now. And the data shows a clear and sustained rise in global average temperatures relative to pre-industrial levels. But what stands out is not only the upward trend, but the consistency across multiple data sets, different scientific institutions using different methods arrive at the same conclusion, that our planet is heating up. But at the same time, the world's population is aging at an unprecedented pace. By 2050, there'll be around 1.6 billion people aged 65 and over, approximately 16% of the global population. And this demographic shift is unfolding alongside a changing climate. And that's what led us back in 2007, 2008, to look at this intersection between aging and climate change. And many older populations will be concentrated in regions facing higher levels of vulnerability, including poverty, inequality, and weaker infrastructure and health systems. Yet they're often the populations who have contributed least to the global emissions. This raises fundamental questions of equity, resilience, and justice across generations and regions. And climate change is not only altering environmental conditions, it's reshaping the experience of aging itself. So to understand this intersection more clearly, Gloria and I developed a very simple framework called what we call the 3 C's. Seeing older people as contributors to the problem, casualties of climate change, and change makers. Taking an holistic approach to the issue. First, older people are contributors. Over the life course, our patterns of consumption shape environmental impact, including how we travel, how we heat our homes, and organize our daily life. These patterns evolve across the life course. In early and middle stages of life, consumption is often more resource intensive. In later life, priorities shift towards health, comfort, and social connection. Emissions do not disappear, they take a different form. Consumption becomes centered on what is sometimes referred to as grey consumption, the energy and resource required for everyday living, including housing, heating, food, local travel, and care. At society level, aging reshapes demand. Many people live alone, households become much smaller, increasing energy use, particularly for heating, and demand for health and care services expands, bringing additional infrastructure and emissions. Understanding this contribution to the problem is important. And so what I would like to just give you an example of something that we did back in about 2008. It was research. We looked at the age-related carbon footprint. So we looked at how households were spending money on food and different goods. How do they spend their money? But then relating that to age. And we came up with this report. In this research, we looked at carbon footprint across different age groups. And the findings were reported in the media. And this is what they reported. Older people most to blame for climate change. So this was never the intention, but it provoked very strong reactions. And I received letters asking, do I hate older people? So that moment stayed with me because it showed how easily complex evidence can be reduced to blame. The real issue is how emissions are produced over time and how uneven they are globally. So if you just look here about the countries that are contributing to CO2 emissions, older people in high-income countries have contributed more historically. By contrast, those in lower-income regions who have contributed least are often the most exposed to climate impacts, particularly where health and social protection systems are weakest. So contribution, therefore, reflects not only age, but inequality. The second C is how older people are casualties of climate change. And this is something that I think we hear a lot about these days, and it focuses very much on the vulnerability of older people. Vulnerability is shaped by exposure, sensitivity, and the ability to cope. And a clear example is heat, which we've heard a lot about yesterday at this World Cafe, and the heat dome back in 2021, which I understand resulted in over 600 deaths here in BC. Older people are facing high risk due to chronic conditions and reduced physiological resilience. And this is something that's happening globally and is expected to increase. By mid-century, up to a quarter of older adults could face dangerous heat conditions. But the outcome, however, is dependent on the context. An older person living alone in poor housing, without access to cooling, and in poor health faces far greater risk during a heat wave. So vulnerability is therefore layered: biological, social, economic, and environmental, and accumulates over the life course. And we heard yesterday about an initiative where people were giving out water, going around to neighborhoods, giving out water during a kind of heat wave to encourage people to drink. Now, the third C is older people as change makers. And this is often the least recognized dimension. Across the world, older adults contribute to climate action in multiple ways. Many hold long-term knowledge of environmental change, particularly in regions where there are custodians of local practices related to agriculture, water, and adaptation. They also play an important role within families and communities, supporting others, sustaining social networks, strengthening resilience. In addition, we see growing forms of civic engagement. And in Canada, older people are mobilizing support for climate action in groups such as the Suzuki Elders and the Seniors for Climate Action. And in Europe, older citizens have pursued legal action in Switzerland. This group of older women brought a case to the European Court of Human Rights, arguing that inadequate climate action violated their rights. So this points to a broader shift. Climate change is increasingly framed as a human rights issue, affecting health, housing, food, water, and dignity. And within this, older people are not only affected, they are active participants in shaping responses. So I want to now just go on to some work that we did with HelpAge International. And in this project, we had some regional dialogues across the world in Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Middle East, and Central Asia. And the objective was to really understand how these regional differences, what it means, climate change to older people in these different regions. And working with HelpAge International, we held a number of webinars to discuss the issues. And I'd like to just give one example here of Africa. So in Africa, in Malawi and Kenya, for example, older people told us that drought is no longer occasional, it is constant, and this is driving food insecurity. Many are living in rural areas, often alone, as younger people migrate to work. Support systems are limited, pensions are weak or absent, and older people are rarely included in climate policy or adaptation planning. But this is only one part of the picture. At the same time, we saw in all of the regions that older people are leading climate action. In Kenya, older people are leading tree planting and reforestation. In Uganda, women are organizing saving groups to invest in fuel-efficient stoves. So we see similar patterns globally. In Latin America, older people are facing crop failure, water shortages, and heat stress, while supporting community resilience. And in Asia, exposure to extreme heat is rising, particularly in rapidly growing cities. And in the Middle East, water scarcity and displacement are reshaping daily life. So the effects of climate change in each region, in one way, is different, but also the same. So an example is like when we talk about heat, and yesterday we heard about how heat affected the people here in this state. But imagine having to deal with heat and you're in an informal settlement, in a slum settlement in Bangladesh, or you're a displaced internal person in a tent maybe in the Middle East, with no air conditioning, no help, no support. So these are the kind of contexts that matter when it comes to understanding the impacts of climate change on older people. So across the very different contexts, one point is clear. Older people are shaping how communities respond. It's, like I say, it's very easy to focus very much on vulnerability, but what we saw in these regional dialogues, there are older people who are very active, who are taking action when it comes to the climate and trying to address some of the challenges and invest in their local community. A project that we're currently doing in the UK, in Scotland, is what we call Climate Wisdom. And here we're working with older people, including those living with dementia, through participatory and creative approaches. The starting point is very simple. Older people often see us as vulnerable, but also have valuable knowledge. And those living with dementia are frequently excluded from climate action. Yet what we see is that they bring experience and practical understanding of living within limits. So our work is in Scotland. We're working with Meeting Centre Scotland. These are kind of places where people with living dementia attend. And there we're undertaking a range of activities to ensure that their voice is heard in climate action planning. We have a climate ambassador training, intergenerational learning, and looking at the place where they live and contributing to policy on local action. So it's really integrating their voice at the local level of this group, but also raising awareness of people living with dementia. It also changes how we think about inclusion. Inclusion is not just about being present, it's also about recognizing what people bring. When that happens, the focus moves from vulnerability to capability. And this is what we're trying to do in Climate Wisdom. And I think it shows that climate action depends as much on people and relationships and building resilience as it does on technology. Another study that we did was looking at healthy aging and climate change. Climate risk is shaped by the place where you live, by housing, access to green space, transport and community support. So in this one, many older people live in homes that overheat in summer, but hard to keep warm in winter. They have limited mobility and can make it harder to access cooler places, services and social networks. So we did a consultation in the 4 regions of the UK, Scotland, Wales, England and Northern Ireland. We spoke with older people about their experience of climate change, and then with them we co-designed local-based solutions. What do they think they need locally in order to increase resilience and protect them from future extreme weather events? And so this is, what I'm going to show you here is a video which summarizes the recommendations. And what was interesting for me yesterday in the World Cafe when we were looking at how climate change impacts people here in Vancouver and British Columbia, that some of these issues were similar but also different. So it's very interesting, and I'd be interested to hear what the people there yesterday think about the recommendations in this report. solutions that we co-designed were very practical, very place-based, and they worked best because they were informed by lived experience and by people who understand their local environment, how it's changing and what support is needed for them. So that, and it talks about how to build local climate resilience, which is about people, place, and participation. So you've heard now, I've spoke about the beginning of the environmental movement, how many older people today were probably part of that movement, how the environment has changed, the environmental problems have changed from ones that we could see, but ones that we now need to anticipate. We've looked at how climate change is impacting older people, a changing climate, an aging population, how that has affected different people around the world, older people in different regions, similar challenges, but additional challenges when it comes to infrastructure and social protection and healthcare. So I would like to end where I began, really. So we meet today here on Earth Day, more than 50 years on the challenge that has evolved and deepened. Climate change and aging are no longer separate issues. They are fundamentally interconnected. And this points to the emergence of what Gloria and I have called climate gerontology, bringing together aging and climate change as a shared field of understanding of policy and action. And when we talk about this climate gerontology, we see it as an emerging interdisciplinary field that examines how population aging and climate change interact, integrating health, equity, social care, behavior, adaptation, and systems perspective. It moves beyond this fragmented approach by recognizing older people not only as vulnerable, but also as contributors and agents of change. And I think this matters because it offers a more coherent way to understand the risk, the resilience, and the response across the life course. It ensures that climate policy and research are grounded in age-specific evidence rather than broad assumptions. And in doing so, I think it strengthens justice and inclusion and participation. It can support governments, practitioners, and researchers in designing more effective age-responsive interventions. And that's something in this work we found that hearing the voice of older people in climate policy, in climate action, is something that is not always heard, and that's what we're trying to do with the projects that we've been working on. So I think late today and tomorrow you'll be hearing more about the discussions around participation and community-based responses. And they're all part of this bigger conversation of the same story. It's a story about how societies adapt and, crucially, who is included in that process. So what I've tried to show is that older people, yes, they are contributors, they are casualties, but they're also change makers. And I think if we fail to recognize all three, we risk misunderstanding both the problem and the solution. So after all that, what needs to change? I think, first of all, we must integrate aging into climate change policy for sure. We must move beyond this narrow focus on vulnerability towards recognizing capability. And we must ensure that older people are active participants in shaping those responses. And there's also an urgent need for these place-based approaches that support communities, both to reduce vulnerability and harness the contribution older people can make. Building climate resilience requires action at individual, social, and community levels, supported by coordinated cross-agency efforts that deliver this integrated approach. And many of you probably heard of age-friendly cities and communities from the World Health Organization. That should also be considered, but not in isolation. We hear about low-carbon cities, age-friendly cities, clean air cities. So it's really bringing all that together into, and also adopting a life course approach, is that how can younger people arrive at old age in a more healthy and resilient way compared to other people in the past. And so climate resilience is really about people. And as I said, if we fail to recognize the role of older people, we overlook one of the greatest resources for change. So going back to the theme of this talk, Earth Day was never meant to be a single day. It was meant to be a change of how we live every day. And if we're serious about addressing the challenge of growing old in a changing climate, then older people must be central to how societies adapt and respond and endure. Thank you.
Well, we have time now for people who want to ask questions or who want to comment on what I think was a really outstanding presentation and setting the stage for our discussions today. There's this microphone here if people want to come up.
We have some others too.
And there's also a handheld. Yep.
There's one right, there's a handheld one right there. Yeah, I think so.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm so excited of being here. I really expected that there's a lot more people here, including the Carney government, all the other ministries. Like, seriously, we're all aging and the climate is changing, so thank you for this. Maybe 2 questions, and you can decide which one makes sense, because they're probably bigger questions. Very excited to see about the climate wisdom with involving persons with dementia. So a little bit more curious about that. Maybe just a brief, very curious about that. The other one is probably more complex in what you're promoting and what you have been doing all this time in the research, in the actions, community, all of that. What might be, this is oversimplified, but what might be one thing you find really helpful when most of the governments today are worried about economy and they sacrifice climate, and that includes Canada? Thank you.
Thank you. So in terms of the climate wisdom, as I said, this is a very new project, another probably pioneering project, where we're working with Meeting Centres Scotland. These are several centres where older people living with dementia actually come, and it's how to include those people in climate action, but not just them, but their carers as well. And it's also breaking down our own, if you like, unconscious bias when it comes to dementia, because it's very easy, and I also learned a lot. My experience of dementia is when I thought about this project, I thought, well, how is it possible? But we know what I've learned working with these dementia organisations, it's a spectrum that people have different strengths and different abilities, and it's so wide, the range of people. So there it's about undertaking activities, but raising awareness of the community. So if you're in a place and it's how you can ensure that the local municipality consider the needs of people living with dementia. It's about raising awareness about the carers, about the impacts of climate change, so it's partly adaptation, and it's using those hubs, so centres, to be more inclusive, to bring other people in. And what we're trying to do there is, like I say, it's just our first year. We're still learning how best to do it. We're developing different methods, but ultimately it's a 5-year project that at the end we will have an approach, a kind of practitioner's guide that we could then promote to other organisations globally about how to include people who live with dementia in climate action. So that's something in progress, and I'm looking for, it's interesting, it's creative and it's challenging, and I'll be happy to report back on that at a future date. So your second question is, and this is something that we see, unfortunately, with the environment back since the 1970s, that when we're doing well as an economy, we all want to have a good environment. But when we're under financial strain, the environment is the first thing to go out the window. And we know that we survive on the planet in order to, we need the planet to survive, so it's a very short a short-term approach. But I guess trying to be optimistic is sometimes, so if you take the example of the crisis that we have now in terms of the increasing cost of oil, and now how that impacts how we travel. People are now thinking about how to save money, and maybe car sharing, reducing the need to travel, looking at public transport. So in some ways, the same result can be presented in a different way. So I could present to you, I could say, oh, reduce your carbon footprint because it's bad for the planet, and you're like, oh yeah, well, I don't care. But if I say to you, save money, reduce your car use, and you say, oh yeah, I want to save money, but then it has the same benefit of reducing demand. In the UK, for example, the whole issue of what's happening in the Middle East and with Iran, we're now looking at energy security. How people were criticizing this investment in renewables. Now we're saying we have to be energy independent. So with some of these crises, it brings up different ways, but the argument is presented in a different way. So we're not looking at climate, we're looking at how can we be independent and not having to import oil. How can we use renewables better for our own security? So it's how you package the issue, and you could be presented in different ways. But I don't know if I answered your question, or you were referring more to aging, please.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, I know it's complex, but thank you. Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
I'm very excited. Thank you.
Is there time for another question?
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you tell us who you are? We'll ask all the speakers.
Humbesadani, father of Sablefish, Raven Tribe, and Hatta, expressing appreciation for the gracious and sincere welcome provided by my friend earlier. I'm a resident of Burnaby, have been since the late 90s. Burnaby is the third most populous component in this metropolitan area after Vancouver and Surrey. I lost my landlord of 22 years, and some days it's approaching the 5th anniversary of that, and the last 10 words I would ever hear him say were, I don't feel very well, I don't know what's wrong. And so in the morning he was gone. And expressed gratitude to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and ambulance people, because we lost 25 seniors in Burnaby, as some of you already know. So a couple of days later, remembering those last 5 years, the last 5 words, I don't know what's wrong, that your internal organs can be dehydrating and becoming dysfunctional, and your body has no way of sending you a specific signal to explain to you what's wrong. Drink water, drink lots of water, drink when you don't want to. So it's a continuing sorrow for me, and but I do have continuing gratitude for the overstrained authorities in our community, and I continue to be very proud to be a Burnabarian, and you're more than welcome to comment as you might wish. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your knowledge. My question is about multi-generational education, grandparents, grandchildren communicating while aging, and also the impact of climate justice. And my second question is, what is the impact of military-industrial complex? Because we are now surrounded by all kinds of wars, and yet we are dying before aging. Thank you. I'm Shiraz. I'm a pacifist, and I have studied gerontology with Gloria and Andrew. Thank you.
So I think this is the intergenerational dialogue, if you like, I think is quite important. And this is something that we wanted to promote when we look at these 3 C's. As you say, it's easy to look at older people as vulnerable, but equally they're a resource to be used. And often climate is probably a bit of ageism is seen as a kind of young person's movement. And there are projects and initiatives that are trying to bridge that gap where you share, you understand between generations of discussing how the environment has changed, how the climate has changed. And we saw this when we did these regional dialogues. We were talking, I think it was in Kazakhstan, they were telling us that the glacier had melted. The older people had told the younger people, don't build on the hillside. They were ignored, and then they built, and then it was like a landslide. And it's about how to use that local knowledge. I think there was another kind of indigenous knowledge about, crops and in agriculture. So I think it's important for the intergenerational discussion is important. One, to share the local environmental knowledge about past, how you were more in tune with the environment, but also how to address the issues of kind of ageism when it comes to the environmental movement. So that's there are a number of initiatives doing that, and that's something that I think we would like to do as well, explore in the future. In terms of your second question, it's quite a challenging one, because I understand war and that we have so many issues going on in the world at the moment, and it's easy to see how climate and climate change, it was so big on the agenda, but now it's going down. People are backtracking, do not want to follow net zero policies to reduce their carbon emissions, and I think it's really up to the governments to stand their position, keep their position. In the UK, we're seeing that in the UK government, but because they're presenting it in a kind of energy security and resilience. So I think it's really, it's a challenging moment. I have no more to say. Thank you.
So this is kind of a complex question. And
Identify yourself, please.
I'm sorry?
Can you identify yourself?
Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Carol Christopher.
Hi, Carol.
I work primarily with an environmental organization, and encouraging Western seniors to reclaim their role as elders in society. So I want to refer to the story that we heard and how significant it is to hear the stories and take in the stories. But one of the stories that's really been sold to us big time is that we're responsible for our carbon footprint. Now, the organization that I belong to does quite a lot of work to help people take individual responsibility. But I think we're also aware in the room that the biggest contributor to emissions are not our individual emissions, it's the industry itself. And so I go back to something that you said, and this is not a criticism of you, but you said it was people were blamed, old people were blamed, and that it was a matter of complex evidence being misinterpreted. And I heard myself say, or was that industry-sponsored disinformation that's been trying over decades to get us to take responsibility for something that I think we now know they knew about 50 or 60 years ago. They knew very clearly what was happening. And yet they continued to hide that information and to now barrage us with disinformation. And so I think it's really important to bring out here, yes, we have some individual responsibility, but we also need to stand up to this industry, the most powerful industry in the history of the world. And I'm curious to know your thoughts about that.
Yes, so what's really interesting, so when I did that study, it was back in 2007. At that point, this issue, this concept of carbon footprint was just being introduced, and my colleagues were at the forefront of that in the UK, looking at, everybody wanted to understand what is the impact of their carbon emissions. So that's when we did that. And what's interesting, during that time, I worked with community groups, working with streets, households, looking at how they can explore a kind of environmental awareness. How can they reduce their emissions from their energy use? How can they recycle? But what has changed, I think, now, and what I found is that in other projects, is that there is an enormous willingness for people to, participate in green behaviours. The challenge is not the willingness, is the infrastructure, the provision, what we call the provisioning systems. And that's, I give an example. In the UK, rail travel is very expensive. It's cheaper to fly than to go by train. And so also, if you want to talk about waste recycling, or when you want to have much more energy efficient homes, if you're a renter, you can't do that because the housing stock is poor. So the carbon footprint is okay to a point, but then it's the system that prevents you, that you're locked into, that you can't change. Now, what you're suggesting is something much more, a bigger picture, the industry. And I guess the question for me is, where do you put that energy? You could put it into advocacy at that bigger picture level, society level, against the oil companies, or you can look at your local level and where you can improve, at the place-based kind of solutions. So I always think it's about, I think there's a need for both, but also locally, like think, act locally, think globally. So, and I see that, and there's different people who put their energies into different aspects. One, really wanting system change, but others also wanting the kind of local change. So I don't think it's an easy solution. I recognize what you're saying, and it has changed. My thinking has changed, that it's a system that has to change, and those kind of, the cost of, the externalities, the pollution is not included in the cost of what we pay for things. And I think most of the people the kind of communities I've worked with, they don't want to think about the low carbon option. That should be the only option. They don't have to think whether they go by car. It should be, the less polluting option. And that's, and at the moment, to be green is hard because you have to think, and it shouldn't be that way. It should be the opposite way. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I recognize the need for local-based, local community solutions, but also addressing the bigger systematic change. Absolutely.
Ooh, working, excellent. Randy Dillon, I'm sorry. I'm a member of the Steelworkers Organization of Active Retirees, and more recently a member of the Coalition of Senior Citizens Organizations of BC. Back when we had the heat dome, both my parents had to move into a air-conditioned hotel. They're very lucky to have the money to be able to do so. At that same time, I was still working in the forest industry in the middle of a 10-acre paved parking lot. And I believe I had my brain boiled there for a week before I took a day off, the day before Lytton burned down. And I took the day off because I thought it was my vacation. It was not. My brain, I had actually lost proper brain function, and I got a phone call basically by the time I got to Lytton that day saying, Randy, you're supposed to be at work. And it's been, anyhow, so that did not happen. So anyhow, I super understand how I was only 62 at the time, is how big of an effect this kind of a thing can happen. I'm going to ask you a question, though, is that I look at things from an intersectional point of view, if I can. War. What kind of a footprint does that have on our whole climate, if you got an idea? Thank you.
Thank you. The impact of war on the climate. I'm sure there's somebody who's studied that. I haven't, but I'm sure obviously it will have some impact. So I can't say, but I can go and look for you. But I'm not aware that they've studied on. I don't know of studies looking at war and impact on climate, but it's an interesting area, but I'm sure somebody has, but I'm not aware, but thank you. But then going back to your question about the heat, I mean, this is an interesting one, and it reminds me, Gloria, of a study that we did. We did a kind of global survey when it comes to aging and climate change. In that study, we found that a lot of people are concerned about, at the time, because obviously attitudes change, at the time older people were concerned about climate change, a global study, but equally they didn't think that they would be impacted by climate change. So it's an issue, but it wouldn't affect them. And it goes back to that level of awareness raising now that we're seeing the reality of climate change, and we need to be more aware of that, how that affects us, and to have that support network for those people who need it, such as people in care homes and that, to recognise that heat is an issue and will be an issue into the future. So it's a kind of education as well and behaviour.
Okay. Thanks, Gloria. Bev Pittman, Healthy Aging at United Way. My name is Bev Pittman, and I'm with Healthy Aging United Way BC. Thanks for telling me. Third time lucky. So my name is Bev Pittman. You know me from yesterday. Yes. I'm with the Healthy Aging team at United Way BC. Vancouver Coastal is my region. So thank you, first of all, Gary, for the presentation. And you invited input from the group yesterday, so I'm standing up in that connection just to offer observations and to thank you. It was very comprehensive and interesting and inspiring. One of the things that I wanted to thank Gloria and yourself for was opening up this new area of climate gerontology. And I think I can see the way that you're opening it up is in relation to a framework from WHO, the World Health Organization, and it has to do with the health, there it is, the age-friendly cities framework. So I see gerontology looking up. Gerontology has a tradition of looking down, studying down. This looks good to me. It's about seeing how gerontologists might work with municipalities, with the organizations in community, with various departments of provincial governments, perhaps, but it could go farther, and this is where industry comes in, and this is where the big players are. Big oil wasn't mentioned. Big oil apparently only amounts to 88 companies in the world, and we seem, I think, I'm afraid, to be really ready to adapt. The orientation of all the recommendations under the World City Framework is towards adaptation. And yet, you mentioned those, how many of them? 200 Swiss seniors, maybe more, and just how successful they were with the European United, or at least the court. And of human rights, right? So how about this? Is there any appeal amongst the gerontologists in the room for a national collaborative? This is what we were doing yesterday across the street, that focused in on the learnings that gerontologists are already generating about the impacts of global warming on older adults in terms of their health and well-being, and all those deaths, such as occurred in the heat dome of 21, and making a legal case, as we saw with the activists behind Big Tobacco, to focus in and bring down those 88 companies. This isn't easy, but it's the kind of documentation. Okay, so are you open to this? Could this be something that climate gerontologists do if they stretch a little higher and speak to this kind of audience?
I think what you're asking, Gary, is a national issue, and that what we're seeing is that there are a number of groups across this country who are involved in the issue of raising awareness and responding to climate change. So it's really up to us as Canadians to think about where we stand and speaking as a unified voice. For any of us who are political animals, we know that where you have an impact with policymakers is if the groups are collaborating and working together rather than competing for the same attention or dollars. So this is really a Canadian issue, something that in planning this conference, as I said at the beginning, we wanted to have the international, we also want a national, and we want a local perceptions. So we're talking here over the next day and a half, ways that we can influence all three. Certainly the age-friendly cities issue and movement is one I am very, very, very familiar with. It happened because the Public Health Agency of Canada happened to have a representative in Rio de Janeiro at the time that the representative from WHO said, I think we should have something on age-friendly cities. And she and I both stood up and says, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. I just want to point out that City of Vancouver only in the last couple of weeks has actually signed up to be part of the WHO Age-Friendly Cities movement. So we as citizens of Vancouver can have some input through the Seniors Advisory Committee that up till recently Anthony Cooper-Schmidt has been heading. So that's something to think about. But what I think Andrew and I and our speakers would want to encourage you is to think about all three levels, sort of the big picture, the intermediate, and the local, and what we can do as individuals, what we can do as members of our cities or our communities, or members of our province. You know, we have a voice. And particularly older adults need to speak up and be heard on a variety of these issues. So on that note, I'd like to